Welcome, everybody. We're delighted that you're here.
Welcome.
And we are going to be live in just a minute.
I think we might be live, in fact.
Lila, how do we tell when people have arrived?
I think we have 17 people are here already, I see in our chat. So I think we can begin.
We're live. We already have 18 people joining us, the perfect Jewish number to begin.
Great.
Great.
So we're delighted that you're here. This is the format for this session. Lila is going to cover some of the key Jewish texts and contexts that are relevant to our discussion. Then I'm going to do some application of them, and we're going to try to save as much time for Q&A as we can in order to facilitate that. If at any point you have a question, please put it in the chat, and when we get to time for Q&A, we will then get through as many of the questions that have shown up in the chat as we can.
All right. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to be here with all of you today. And thank you to SRE for the invitation to discuss this important topic around confidentiality and disclosure, really all from a Jewish perspective. And this session will also touch on issues of naming harm. Who is being heard? Who is being protected? Judaism, as of course many of you already know, because of course you've been in many sessions today, has a great deal to say regarding reporting, accountability, how to engage with someone who has been wronged, and what the responses ought to be. So today we'll look at these sources from a Jewish ethical perspective. And this is messy and it's complicated, and it bears saying that there are many ways in which to think about these issues in the Jewish tradition. These are just some. I wanted to begin our time together by sharing and creating a framework, a glossary of terms, if you will, relating to our topic at hand, specifically around confidentiality and disclosure. And my intent really is to frame this issue in as a Jewish issue in a Jewish context. And these terms and concepts that are often at play in this context, and which I will briefly explore during our time together, is by no means exhaustive. And it ought to be mentioned that these terms can be used or accessed from a variety of perspectives and places of power. They are central terms and central texts to this discussion, but again, can be used and engaged with in positive or perhaps negative contexts and fashions. The terms that I will explore alongside some of these foundational texts are concepts of lashon hara and rechilut, gossip and slander, kvod habriot, human dignity, dignity more broadly, mesira, issues about the informant or informing, azhara, issues relating to warning, and I'll touch on the topic of hocheach tochiach, rebuking. These terms and themes are obviously prevalent in our discussions regarding confidentiality and disclosure in and of itself is an issue is complex. And at the same time, it's really rooted in tradition. It's connected to being thoughtful about our actions and also being aware, not forgetting and disclosing issues and events when necessary. I'm very curious about this topic and have found it to be deeply rooted in a text from Dvarim, from Deuteronomy, in 4:9. But take utmost care. Rak hishamer lacha ushmor nafshecha me'od. Take utmost care and watch yourselves scrupulously so that you do not forget things, but that you saw with your own eyes. Remember, you saw them with your own eyes so that they do not fade from your mind as long as you live. I think this is an important concept to root our conversation around disclosure, because it is both about noticing, about awareness, being watchful, being scrupulous, but also holding on to these memories. In other words, remembering such that you can disclose and make them known to your children and your children's children, which is to say, pass on that information, disclose to whom needs to be disclosed to. We're going to unpack these concepts further, but I did want to transition us to some thoughts and texts around Lashon Hara, which I think once we have this idea of disclosure, we have to ask questions about gossip or slander, how to disclose, what is a respectful way to disclose, are there rules when it comes to disclosure, are there codes of ethics when it comes to disclosure? Which leads us into a conversation of Lashon Hara, which again is a text rooted in Vayikra, the book of Leviticus. Lo telech rechil be'amecha, lo tamod al dam re'echa, ani Adonai. Thou shalt not go up and down as a talebearer, somebody who tells tales of others among your people. Neither shalt thou stand idly by the blood of your neighbor. I am God. So the Mishnah Torah, Maimonides, the Rambam, derives a halacha, a Jewish teaching, a law even, maybe a way of living around this topic. A person who collects gossip about colleagues or friends violates a prohibition, the prohibition in Vayikra, in Leviticus, of do not go around and gossiping about your people. And even though this transgression is not punishable by lashes, Maimonides is very invested in what the punishments are. It is a severe sin and can cause the death of many people, many Jews. And that's why it's connected to that following verse around do not stand by idly when the blood of your neighbor is being spilled. However, it must be stated, and I think we all have to understand this, that gossip and disclosure are different. This is all rooted in intent. To disclose something with the intent of disclosure, of safety, is not the same thing as idle gossip or rechilut or slander. So when we talk about that relationship between gossip, slander, and of course between disclosure, we need to talk about who is doing the informing, who is engaged in this. So what then of mesirah, of the informant? Judaism discusses the informant in a variety of contexts. We can't go into all of them here today. But typically, being an informant is frowned upon unless there is a threat. And in the Mishnah Torah, there's an entire segment that is discussed around one who injures a person or property. And the discussion of this informant is very, very strong. Any informer may be slain anywhere, even at the present time when Jewish courts do not try capital cases. So there's a concept that Jewish courts do not actually try capital cases, but an informant, mutar laharoka mosar. The person who's an informant can be slain anywhere. It's permissible to slay them before they even do the informing. So there's something very powerful here. But the Choshen Mishpat and the Shulchan Aruch, the codes, says if this person is a threat to the community, you may inform on him. So yes, we take the informant's role very seriously and we are careful and we are cautious. And yet, if there's anything that needs to be informed upon, if there's any threat in a community, you may, in fact, you are encouraged to be therefore the informant. If one causes tangible harm, even to an individual, to anyone, you may inform the authorities. And this is in the Shulchan Aruch. So how do we even know about this wrongful doing? How do we even know that which we will be informing upon? This comes down to an issue of azhara, of warning, a moral imperative to do the warning around the individual that might cause tangible harm. And the idea of warning is a very robust one in the Jewish tradition, rooted very much in, again, the book of Dvarim, Deuteronomy, where there is a concept of when you build a new house, kitivneh bait chadash, ve'asita ma'akeh. When you build a new house, you will make a parapet, kind of a fence around your roof, so you do not bring blood guilt. In other words, nobody falls or has an accident on your house if anyone should fall from it. This ma'akeh, this parapet, is really the warning. It is the warning to safeguard the people. It is the warning that we share with others in case there is imminent danger or even danger potentially in the future. And all of these issues, the warning, azhara, lashon hara, rechilut, gossip and slander, the issues relating to mesirah, relating to disclosure, are all rooted in one very important concept in Judaism, kvod habriot, human dignity, the moral imperative, the halacha, really, the Jewish law, to uphold human dignity. One of my rabbis, Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, says, because humans are the image of God, they are endowed by their creator with three intrinsic dignities: infinite value, equality, and uniqueness. And we uphold those values with the Jewish teaching. Jewish teachings from Avot Rabbi Natan, who says that your dignity, yehi kavod chavercha chaviv alecha keshelcha, that the honor of your fellow, of your peer, should be as dear to you as your own. We look out for the honor of others. And if we need a reminder of what that honor could look like, we think to ourselves what would feel honorable or dignified to ourselves. These are foundational texts used to navigate the world of confidentiality, disclosure. They're all rooted in a Jewish context. And again, very much rooted in this idea and this concept of kvod habriot and human dignity. So that sets a frame and some glossary of terms for us that we can use as tools in our toolkit to continue the conversation. And now I will pass this on to Rabbi Teutsch.
Thanks. Really helpful introduction. So I want to start by saying that what I'll be drawing on primarily is my experience as a consultant and an investigator who have unfortunately dealt with far too many of these situations over the last bunch of years. And in that regard, I'm not representing that what I say is either SRE policy or legal advice. I really want to look at this through a Jewish framework to the fullest extent that I can. One of the big issues that comes up is how we handle non-disclosure agreements. And it's important to understand that NDAs is actually a very broad term. There are many different kinds of non-disclosure agreements. Some of them are perfectly reasonable and normal. For example, if you're being interviewed for a job at a high-tech company, very often you're required to sign an NDA before the interview process starts because they're going to want to disclose certain kind of information about their firm that they want to keep confidential. That's a completely legitimate kind of NDA. And similarly, if you work for a high-tech firm or you're in marketing or you're in product development, really often you sign a non-disclosure agreement that says you will keep the firm's proprietary information confidential. And that kind of NDA is perfectly legitimate. The kind of NDA that is much more worrisome is one that attempts to silence employees leaving the organization. And occasionally, an NDA also can silence the organization about an employee. Those are the kinds of NDAs that I urge individuals and organizations not to sign. And the reason lies considerably in what Lila was talking about. If someone's been wronged by the organization, whether it's emotional harassment or sexual harassment or some other kind of workplace misdemeanor, that person has an obligation to warn anybody else who might go to work for that company that they could be subject to the same kind of abuse. Into the of warning. The organization may also be in a position where it needs to give a reference on a former employee. That came up recently in a case that I dealt with where the employee had been emotionally abusive to all that person's supervisees. And when the organization was asked for a reference for from another organization that was about to hire this person, because they had not signed an NDA, they were in a position to warn that organization about that behavior that had occurred at the previous organization and then leave it up to the new organization whether they wanted to hire under those circumstances. An NDA could have prevented them from doing that and therefore prevented them from fulfilling their obligation to warn. A second problem with that kind of NDA is if strictly observed, it means that the person who may have been abused is not in a position to talk about it with others in a way that gets the emotional support that that person needs and is entitled to. So that's another category of reason for not signing an NDA. And when an NDA is signed, very often that allows continued abuse in a variety of ways. The vast majority of investigations that I've done over many years, there has not been just a single case of abuse. Usually there's one presenting case, but when there's a thorough investigation, you could turn up half a dozen or a dozen or even more cases of abuse by that same person that those other cases were never reported until there was finally a whistleblower. So when someone signs an NDA and as a condition of getting their severance pay, that means that that abuse that has already occurred cannot be discovered. And it also means that other people are very likely to be subject to that abuse in the future. So best policy is never to bind the sake of the safety of the broader community, as well as in order to allow the person injured to go about a process of recovering as fully possible. So I'm told that the last thing I said broke up. So let me back up and say an effective policy on NDAs, in my opinion, bans the NDA that restricts the employer from commenting on the employee, and it should ban the requirement that departing employees have to sign an NDA in order to get a settlement or to get their severance. I hope that was the missing piece. So when we're thinking about the issue of mutual support, we're looking at something that's really an important part of the recovery process. And one of the effects of being a person who steps forward and talks about something bad that happened to them is that it very often allows others to come forward, and that is a really important part of the healing process for everyone. So when I'm dealing with someone who's been subjected to any kind of abuse or harassment, I do my best to support them to bring that out into the open, both in reporting it within the organization and reporting it beyond the organization, not just for their sake, but for the sake of the other people who have been hurt by those behaviors. So let me stop there. And we want to spend some time taking your questions. And Lila's been kind enough to say that she would bring the questions up that have come into the chat. So do we have one to begin? Lila, are you there? Yeah. Can we discuss how the texts from that Lila gave work with what I just spoke about? Let me say we're both rabbis, so right, we can be either or both.
I mean, maybe Gila, you're asking. Maybe one of the questions is some of those practical matters, and I'd be curious to hear, Rabbi Teutsch, when you're grappling with a matter that comes to you, and both of us work in the field of ethics and do some mediation, but I'm curious for you, and you've given some real world examples already. How do you deal with issues of lashon hara or of Mesira? Do you factor those in? Are they? Do you have a code of ethics that you apply in thinking about that framework or those concepts when you are deliberating with somebody that you're consulting with?
Usually the first thing I have to do is interview people to find out what happened. And that means sitting down with individuals. The last couple of years, it's just been on Zoom, but formally in person, and asking them to tell me their story and trying to do it in the most open-ended way possible. That's often a really emotional experience for the person telling their story. So I have to not only listen with an investigator's ear, but also be as supportive as I can. That is, in my mind, not the prohibited kind of gossip, because it is telling a story for the purpose of accomplishing a greater good. And not infrequently, I can get that storyteller to refer me to another person who might have a story. And eventually, without attaching names, I also interview the accused perpetrator and feed back to them what I'm hearing and ask them what their experience is and what they thought was going on. There is often a significant variance between the two stories. So that's one reason why talking to as many people as possible is so important. But when I then narrate, often to an executive director and then to a board, or in the case of a synagogue, directly to a president and then the board, I make sure to tell as much as I can in a purely evidentiary mode. That is to say, I don't give my opinions usually about motives, because if I'm wrong, that's motzi shem ra. I'm marring somebody's reputation.